When a royal child entered the world in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, or imperial China, their first breath wasn't greeted with unconditional joy. It was greeted with inspection. The moment of birth was never private for royalty. Midwives, physicians, priests, and witnesses crowded into birth chambers, their presence legally required to verify legitimacy. But they weren't just there to confirm the baby was real. They were there to determine if the baby was acceptable. In ancient Rome, the system was brutally transparent. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, held absolute legal power over his newborn's fate through a rite called ius exponendi, the rite of exposure. When a baby was born, it was placed at the father's feet. If he picked it up, the child lived. If he turned away, the child was carried outside the city walls and left to die. This wasn't murder under Roman law. It was simply choosing not to accept the child into the family. The distinction was legal, not moral, and it was practiced by emperors and peasants alike. The criteria for rejection were coldly practical. Physical deformities topped the list. A baby born with visible disabilities, twisted limbs, or unusual features faced immediate rejection. Gender mattered desperately. Families already burdened with daughters had little use for another girl who would require an expensive dowry. Birth order played its role too. A third or fourth son in a family where inheritance laws favored the eldest might be deemed surplus to requirements. Even the timing of birth could seal a child's fate. A baby born during political upheaval, when resources were scarce, or when the family couldn't afford another mouth to feed, simply had worse odds. Sparta took this system even further. According to ancient sources, Spartan newborns underwent examination by the Gerousia, a council of elders who served as judges of physical worthiness. The baby was evaluated for strength, symmetry, and vigor. Those who failed inspection were allegedly taken to the Apothetai, a chasm on Mount Taygetus. Modern historians debate whether this practice was as widespread as ancient sources claimed, but the principle was clear across ancient Greece. Weak children threatened the strength of the state. Medieval Europe wrapped the same brutality in religious language. Babies born with deformities were called monstrous births, divine punishments, or demonic influences. Medical texts from the period described these children in terms that mixed theology with primitive medicine. A child born with physical abnormalities might be seen as evidence of their mother's sin, their father's corruption, or divine displeasure with the entire family line. The Church officially opposed infanticide, but it provided convenient alternatives. Emergency baptism, performed when a child seemed unlikely to survive, gave parents ecclesiastical permission to let nature take its course without providing medical care. Monasteries and convents became repositories for children deemed unsuitable for public life. In imperial China, the Confucian concept of the mandate of heaven applied even to newborns. An emperor's heir needed to embody celestial perfection. Any physical or perceived spiritual flaw could be interpreted as heaven withdrawing its mandate from the dynasty. While detailed records of specific cases are scarce due to the culture of discretion surrounding imperial families, the principle was understood. Imperfection in an heir was imperfection in the cosmic order itself. The birth chamber itself reflected these brutal realities. Royal births required witnesses not just to verify legitimacy, but to provide testimony if questions arose later about the child's fitness. In some courts, the witnesses included foreign ambassadors, whose reports home would either confirm or deny the arrival of a suitable heir. A baby's first hours were spent being measured against standards that had nothing to do with their humanity and everything to do with their utility. These weren't isolated practices of particularly cruel individuals. These were systems, legal frameworks, cultural expectations that spanned continents and centuries. From Rome to China, from ancient Greece to medieval Europe, societies developed elaborate methods for determining which royal children deserved to live and which were better off dead. The specific criteria varied, the religious justifications differed, but the underlying principle remained constant. Not every child born into royalty was deemed worthy of wearing a crown. But what happened when inspection revealed something wrong? when the baby at the father's feet had twisted limbs, when the council of elders shook their heads, when the midwife whispered that the imperial heir bore marks of imperfection. The moments after rejection were measured in hours, not days. And what happened in those hours was determined by how quickly, how quietly, and how permanently the problem could be eliminated. The moment of rejection didn't come with debate or deliberation. It came with a glance, a gesture, a turned head. And once that decision was made, the machinery of elimination moved with shocking speed. In ancient Rome, when a father refused to lift his newborn from the ground, servants already knew their instructions. The baby would be wrapped in cloth, carried beyond the city boundaries, and placed at specific locations where exposure was customary. The columna lactaria, a column near the Temple of Pietas, became so associated with abandoned infants that it gave its name to the practice. This wasn't a secret shame, it was legal procedure. Roman law didn't classify exposure as murder because the child was never formally accepted into the family in the first place. Legally, they had never existed. The practice was so common that entrepreneurs operated near exposure sites, collecting abandoned babies to raise as slaves or beggars. Archaeological evidence supports this wasn't rare. Excavations of Roman sewers and dumps have revealed the remains of newborns, their tiny bones testament to how routine this elimination was. The speed of these decisions reveals their systematic nature. Babies were exposed within hours of birth, usually before dawn the day after delivery. This timing served multiple purposes. The cover of darkness provided discretion for families who, despite legal sanction, preferred privacy. The quick timeline prevented emotional attachment. And most practically, it ensured the baby died before anyone outside the birth chamber needed to know the child had existed at all. But exposure required carrying the baby outside city walls, which created witnesses and risks. For royal families concerned with reputation, more discreet methods existed. Medieval medical texts, written for physicians attending aristocratic births, contain coded instructions for hastening natural death in newborns deemed unsuitable. These weren't explicit murder manuals, but their meaning was clear to those who needed to understand. A midwife could delay clearing an infant's airway. A physician could recommend against providing warmth to a weak baby. Death by neglect in the first hours after birth looked like natural causes, especially in an era when infant mortality was already devastatingly high. Historical records provide glimpses of how this worked in practice. When royal births produced disappointing results, official announcements were carefully worded. "The child lived but briefly" became a common phrase in court records. "Born weak and commended to God's care" signaled a baby who received baptism but little else. These formulaic statements appear with suspicious frequency in genealogies of royal families, particularly regarding children born with apparent disabilities or those whose existence complicated succession plans. The role of witnesses in these first hours was complex. The same people required to verify the birth often became complicit in the death. Midwives, physicians, and noble attendants understood the unspoken rules. Speaking about what happened in the birth chamber could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. Silence was enforced through a combination of legal threats and financial incentives. Those who participated in eliminating an unsuitable heir were protecting the dynasty, a service that could be rewarded with positions, land, or gold. Some royal parents attempted to sidestep direct responsibility through calculated neglect. Rather than active killing, they would order that minimal care be provided. A baby might be given to wet nurses known for poor survival rates among their charges. The child might be housed in distant, poorly maintained quarters of the palace where cold and disease did the work that direct violence might have accomplished more quickly. This created plausible deniability. When the inevitable death came, it could be attributed to the child's inherent weakness rather than deliberate abandonment. The psychological pressure on royal mothers during these first hours was crushing. They had just endured the physical trauma of birth, only to watch as their newborn was evaluated like livestock. If rejection came, they were often powerless to intervene. Speaking against the decision could brand them as hysterical or, worse, disloyal to the dynasty. Some sources suggest that mothers were sometimes removed from the birth chamber immediately after delivery, precisely to prevent them from bonding with or attempting to protect a child already marked for elimination. Religious authorities played ambiguous roles in these first hours. The church officially condemned infanticide, but church officials were present at royal births and rarely intervened to prevent what happened next. Instead, they provided the ritual cleansing that allowed the system to continue. A quick baptism ensured the baby's soul would be saved even if its body was not. This theological compromise allowed everyone involved to maintain the fiction that they were acting within moral bounds, even as they participated in systematic killing. The speed of these decisions meant that many royal babies marked for elimination died before dawn of their first day. By the time morning came, the birth chamber would be cleaned, the witnesses dismissed, and the official story prepared. If anyone outside the inner circle asked about the child, they would hear that the baby was stillborn, or lived only briefly, or was too weak from the start. The machinery of elimination had done its work, and life at court continued as though nothing had happened. But not every rejected baby died in those first hours. Some survived the initial decision, either because their flaws weren't immediately apparent, or because someone intervened to delay their elimination. For these children, what came next wasn't mercy. It was a slower form of the same fate, one that played out over years instead of hours in places designed to hide royal embarrassments from public view. For royal children who survived the first hours and days, but were still deemed unsuitable for public life, European courts developed a solution that allowed them to claim mercy while practicing cruelty. Monasteries, convents, and isolated towers became prisons disguised as protection. These children would live, technically, but they would live hidden away where their existence couldn't embarrass the dynasty or complicate succession. What sounds like compassion was often just a slower method of elimination. Don Carlos of Austria provides the most thoroughly documented example of this system in action. Born in 1545 to Philip II of Spain and Maria Manuela of Portugal, Don Carlos was heir to the most powerful empire on earth. But from birth, something was wrong. His mother died 4 days after delivering him, possibly from complications related to the difficult birth. The baby himself showed immediate signs of trouble. Contemporary accounts describe physical deformities, though the specific details vary between sources. What's certain is that as Carlos grew, his behavior became increasingly erratic, and his physical condition deteriorated. Philip II faced an impossible dilemma. Carlos was his only son and legal heir. Rejecting him meant the end of the Spanish Habsburg line in Spain. But presenting him as a future king risked destabilizing the empire. Philip's solution was institutionalization disguised as education and care. Carlos was surrounded by tutors, physicians, and attendants, but their real job wasn't to prepare him for kingship. It was to keep him contained and controlled. The conditions Carlos lived under reveal the reality behind the facade of care. He was housed in isolated apartments within the palace, with guards controlling who could enter or leave. His erratic behavior, documented by diplomats and courtiers, included violent outbursts, paranoid accusations, and actions that suggested severe mental instability. Historical sources describe him attempting to attack servants, making threats against his own father, and displaying behavior that terrified everyone around him. Whether these behaviors resulted from organic brain conditions, the effects of inbreeding, or the psychological trauma of his isolated existence, historians still debate. What's clear is that Philip eventually decided Carlos represented too great a risk. In January 1568, Philip had his son arrested and imprisoned in his own chambers. The official explanation was that Carlos was ill and needed rest. The reality was house arrest. For 6 months, Carlos lived in rooms that had been converted into a cell. Windows were sealed. Guards controlled everything that entered or left. On July 24, 1568, Carlos died. The official cause was natural illness, possibly complicated by self-imposed fasting. But the timing, the circumstances, and Philip's subsequent refusal to allow proper investigation led many contemporaries to conclude that Carlos had been deliberately allowed to die, if not actively killed. Carlos wasn't unique. European royal families regularly used religious institutions as dumping grounds for inconvenient children. Daughters born with disabilities were sent to convents, officially to live holy lives of prayer, actually to disappear from succession discussions. Sons deemed unfit were housed in monasteries, where they could be forgotten by everyone except those paid to keep them confined. These institutions provided perfect cover. No one questioned why a royal child lived in a monastery. It could be spun as piety, as concern for the child's spiritual welfare, as protection from the corrupting influences of court life. The living conditions in these institutions varied dramatically based on how much the family wanted to spend. Wealthy families could ensure their hidden children lived in relative comfort, even luxury, as long as they remained out of sight. But comfort wasn't the point. Control was. These children, no matter how well fed or well housed, lived as prisoners. They couldn't leave, couldn't marry, couldn't have children of their own. They existed in a state of permanent suspension, alive, but removed from life. England's royal family provides additional examples. Several children of King George III showed signs of mental instability, possibly inherited conditions that ran in the family. Rather than acknowledge this publicly, these children were housed in isolated quarters of Windsor Castle. They received excellent medical care by the standards of the time, but they lived behind locked doors, their existence barely acknowledged even within court circles. When they died, often young, their deaths were recorded in family genealogies, but rarely discussed in public records. The psychological torture of this existence is impossible to fully reconstruct, but hints survive in the historical record. Some institutionalized royal children wrote letters begging for release, for visits from family members, for any contact with the outside world. These letters, when they survive in archives, reveal desperate loneliness, confusion about why they were being punished, and growing awareness that their confinement would last until death. Other children stopped writing entirely, succumbing to the despair of permanent isolation. Monasteries and convents became expert at managing these situations. They knew how to keep secrets, how to maintain the illusion of care while enforcing absolute control, and most importantly, how to ensure that when these inconvenient royals died, they died quietly. The causes of death listed in monastic records are revealing in their vagueness. Fever covered everything from actual illness to deliberate neglect. Melancholy could mean depression that led to self-starvation or simply giving up on life. Natural causes was the default explanation that prevented further questions. The system served everyone except the children trapped within it. Royal families eliminated embarrassment without the scandal of outright murder. Religious institutions received generous donations and royal favor. Physicians and attendants kept prestigious positions. The only people who suffered were the children themselves, living out years or decades in isolation. Their existence acknowledged just enough to prevent them from being completely forgotten, but never enough to let them actually live. But institutionalization only worked for children whose disabilities or behaviors made them manageable. For royal heirs who grew into adults and became active threats to the established order, more permanent solutions were required. When a hidden child tried to escape, when an institutionalized heir started demanding their rights, when a supposedly controlled situation threatened to become public, the system stopped pretending to be merciful. Institutionalization worked as long as the hidden child remained passive. But what happened when royal heirs deemed unsuitable refused to stay hidden? When they grew old enough to understand what had been taken from them? When they developed supporters who believed they deserved their inheritance? At that point, European courts stopped pretending these were children in need of care and started treating them as political threats to be eliminated. The Princes in the Tower stand as the most famous case of royal children murdered for political convenience. In 1483, 12-year-old Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, were the sons of the late King Edward IV of England. When their father died, Edward V should have become king. Instead, Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the boys illegitimate based on a questionable claim that their parents' marriage had been invalid. Richard took the crown for himself as Richard III. The boys were moved to the Tower of London, officially for their protection while the succession was sorted out. They were seen playing in the Tower grounds for several weeks. Then they disappeared. They were never seen again. No official announcement of their deaths was ever made. No bodies were ever officially identified. They simply vanished from history while under their uncle's protection. In 1674, workmen remodeling the tower discovered a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 children hidden under a staircase. The remains were assumed to be the princes and were reburied in Westminster Abbey, but they've never been conclusively identified. The most likely explanation, accepted by most historians, is that Richard III had his nephews killed sometime in the late summer of 1483. The method remains unknown. Suffocation with pillows was the rumor that spread at the time, supposedly because it left no visible marks. But there's no proof, no confession, no contemporary account from anyone who actually witnessed what happened. The princes were inconvenient. Then they were gone, and Richard III never provided an explanation for their disappearance, which itself suggests guilt. If the boys had died naturally while in his care, announcing their deaths would have removed them as threats just as effectively. The silence suggests something that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Russia provides an even more brutal example of a father eliminating his own son. In November 1581, Ivan IV of Russia, known as Ivan the Terrible, killed his son and heir Ivan Ivanovich in a fit of rage. This case is particularly well documented because it happened in front of witnesses, and the Tsar himself never denied what he had done. According to multiple contemporary sources, including accounts from foreign diplomats at the Russian court, Ivan the Terrible struck his son on the head with his pointed staff during an argument. The blow caused a fatal head wound. The circumstances leading to the murder reveal the paranoia that consumed Ivan's court. The younger Ivan had been accompanying his father on military campaigns and had begun to show independence and competence that threatened the Tsar's absolute control. Some sources suggest the argument that led to the murder involved the younger Ivan's pregnant wife, whose clothing the Tsar deemed immodest. He beat her, causing her to miscarry, and when his son confronted him about this violence, Ivan's rage exploded into patricide. The aftermath was immediate remorse. Ivan the Terrible attempted to undo what he had done, cradling his dying son and begging forgiveness. But the damage was done. The younger Ivan died several days later. The murder threw the Russian succession into chaos because it left the Tsar's second son, the intellectually disabled Fyodor, as heir. This succession crisis would eventually contribute to the time of troubles that nearly destroyed the Russian state. Ivan the Terrible had eliminated a perceived threat and in doing so destabilized everything he'd built. Peter the Great of Russia repeated this pattern with his own son more than a century later. Prince Alexei Petrovich, born in 1690, grew up opposing his father's radical reforms and European-influenced policies. Alexei represented the old Russia that Peter was trying to destroy, and father and son became bitter enemies. When Alexei fled to Austria seeking protection, Peter lured him back with false promises of forgiveness. Instead, Alexei was arrested, subjected to torture to extract confessions of treason, and died in prison in 1718 under circumstances that strongly suggest he was murdered or tortured to death on his father's orders. The trial documents survive, and they're chilling. Alexei confessed under torture to plotting against his father and hoping Peter would die so he could reverse the reforms. Whether these confessions reflected real plots or were simply whatever Alexei said to make the torture stop, historians still debate. What's certain is that Peter the Great saw his son as an obstacle to his vision for Russia and eliminated that obstacle with legal procedures that provided a veneer of justice over what was essentially political murder. These cases share common patterns. The children were initially tolerated as long as they remained controllable, but once they showed signs of developing independent power bases, once they represented alternative centers of loyalty, Once they threatened to undo what their fathers or relatives had built, they became intolerable. At that point, the usual restraints against killing family members dissolved. Political necessity, as defined by those in power, trumped any biological bond. The methods varied. Some were murdered in secret, like the princes in the tower. Others were killed in rage, like Ivan Ivanovich. Still others were subjected to show trials and legal murder, like Prince Alexei. But the result was always the same. Children who should have inherited power instead became victims of that same power. They learned too late that being born royal offered no protection when their existence threatened someone more powerful. The witnesses to these murders faced their own terrible choices. Speaking about what they had seen could mean their own deaths. Remaining silent made them complicit. Most chose silence. Court records from these periods show a remarkable absence of detailed testimony about the deaths of inconvenient heirs. The people who knew what really happened took those secrets to their own graves, protecting themselves and the system that required such murders to function. But there was another group of victims in this system, ones whose suffering extended over decades rather than ending in a single violent moment. The mothers who bore these children, who watched them be deemed unsuitable, who witnessed their institutionalization or murder, and who could do nothing to protect them. Royal mothers occupied a uniquely terrible position in this system. They were required to produce heirs, expected to do so repeatedly despite devastating risks, and then forced to watch as the children they'd risked their lives to deliver were evaluated, judged, and potentially eliminated. Their own survival often depended on producing the right kind of child, the right gender, the right level of physical perfection. And when they failed to meet these impossible standards, they bore the blame along with the loss. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, experienced this nightmare across decades. Married to Henry II of France in 1533, she spent the first 10 years of her marriage unable to conceive, a failure that threatened her position and gave her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, even more power at court. When Catherine finally began bearing children, she produced 10 pregnancies over 13 years. But the obsessive drive to secure the succession came with terrible costs. Several of her children died in infancy or early childhood. Of those who survived, many were sickly, and some showed signs of the physical and mental problems that ran through both the Valois and Medici bloodlines. The pressure Catherine faced wasn't just about producing children. It was about producing specific children at specific times for specific political purposes. Her sons who survived to adulthood, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, all served as kings of France, but their reigns were marked by illness, instability, and failure to produce heirs of their own. Catherine watched her life's work, the 10 pregnancies that had nearly killed her multiple times, produce a dynasty that was eating itself from within. The obsessive intermarriage that was supposed to keep power concentrated had instead concentrated genetic problems that manifested in her children and grandchildren. The Habsburg dynasty provides an even more extreme example of how the system punished mothers for outcomes they couldn't control. For generations, the Habsburgs practiced strategic intermarriage between close relatives to keep their vast territories unified. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and the genetic consequences accumulated over generations. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, he was the product of so much inbreeding that his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. Charles II's mother, Mariana of Austria, had married her uncle Philip IV. She was his niece. Their son Charles was born with severe physical and intellectual disabilities that made him barely functional as a human being, much less as a king. The autopsy performed after Charles's death in 1700 revealed internal organs so malformed and diseased that physicians marveled he had lived at all. Mariana spent decades caring for a son who couldn't properly feed himself, couldn't speak clearly, and couldn't produce an heir. When he finally died at age 38, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him, and Europe exploded into the War of Spanish Succession that killed hundreds of thousands. The cruelest irony is that Mariana and the other Habsburg mothers were praised for their devotion to family and dynasty. They were doing exactly what the system required, marrying close relatives to keep power concentrated. But the system that demanded this loyalty destroyed their children from within. The mothers were both instruments of the destruction and its most intimate witnesses. They felt their babies move in the womb, endured the agony of childbirth, and then watched as genetic disasters unfolded in slow motion over years or decades. Some mothers tried to protect their vulnerable children and were punished for it. When royal sons showed signs of disability or political unreliability, mothers who defended them could be accused of disloyalty to the dynasty. Speaking against the decision to institutionalize or eliminate a child branded the mother as hysterical, as placing maternal feeling above dynastic duty, as fundamentally failing to understand her role. The system required mothers to produce children and then required them to accept whatever happened to those children without protest. The emotional toll this took is difficult to fully document because royal women were expected to maintain composure and dignity regardless of what they privately felt. But hints survive in letters, in reports from ladies-in-waiting, in the physical and mental breakdowns that some royal mothers experienced after losing multiple children. Some turned to religion, spending hours in chapel praying for the souls of children who had died in infancy or been taken from them. Others became withdrawn and depressed, going through the motions of court life while privately grieving losses they could never publicly acknowledge. The biological burden alone was staggering. Royal women were expected to become pregnant as soon as possible after marriage and to continue bearing children until menopause or death, whichever came first. Eleanor of Aquitaine survived 10 pregnancies. Catherine de' Medici endured 10. Many royal women faced 8, 10, 15 pregnancies over their fertile years. Each pregnancy carried roughly a 1 in 3 chance of death from complications. Surviving childbirth didn't guarantee surviving the recovery period, when infections and hemorrhaging could kill days or weeks later. This meant that royal mothers were simultaneously producing children and mourning them. They might be pregnant with one child while still grieving another who had died, been rejected, or been taken away for institutionalization. The cycle never stopped. As soon as one child was born, the pressure began to produce the next one, to provide the spare heir, to ensure succession, even if something happened to the first. Royal mothers existed in a state of permanent reproductive crisis. The system also created terrible situations where mothers had to choose between their children. If resources were limited, or if acknowledging one child meant disadvantaging another in the succession, mothers faced impossible decisions. Some prioritized the child most likely to survive and succeed. A rational calculation that meant abandoning the weaker or less politically valuable child. Others tried to protect all their children equally and were crushed by the impossibility of that task. Royal mothers who outlived their husbands sometimes gained enough power to protect their surviving children. But this came too late for the children already lost. Catherine de' Medici became one of the most powerful women in Europe as Queen Mother and Regent. But that power couldn't resurrect the children who had died young, or undo the genetic damage that plagued her surviving sons. She had all the power she'd ever wanted, and it was useless for the thing that mattered most. The historical record preserves these women primarily through their relationship to successful sons or through their failures. The mothers of children who were rejected, institutionalized, or murdered rarely have their stories told from their own perspective. We see them through court records, through letters written by others, through the absence in genealogies where a child should be but isn't. Their grief is a shadow in the historical record, acknowledged only when it became politically inconvenient, or when it manifested in ways that others couldn't ignore. But the weight of accumulated loss, the biological toll of repeated pregnancies, the emotional burden of watching the system destroy children they'd produced, all of this had consequences that extended beyond individual mothers. The entire structure of royal succession, built on the idea that concentrating power in specific bloodlines would create stability, was destroying itself through the very mechanisms designed to preserve it. The system designed to protect royal dynasties through selective breeding and ruthless elimination of unsuitable heirs ultimately accomplished the opposite. It concentrated genetic problems, created succession crises, and destroyed the very bloodlines it was meant to preserve. The final irony of royal infanticide and institutionalization is that the dynasties that practiced it most ruthlessly were the ones that suffered the most catastrophic consequences. The Spanish Habsburgs provide the most scientifically documented example of this self-destruction. In 2009, a team of geneticists led by Gonzalo Alvarez published a study analyzing 15 generations of Habsburg intermarriage. Using genealogical records, they calculated the coefficient of inbreeding for Habsburg family members across 2 centuries. The results were staggering. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, his coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254, higher than the expected value for children born to siblings. This wasn't accident. This was the deliberate result of a breeding strategy that prioritized keeping power concentrated in family hands above all other considerations. For 200 years, the Habsburgs had married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, creating a genetic bottleneck that trapped recessive genetic problems in their bloodline. Each generation, the problems compounded. The famous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite caused by mandibular prognathism, appeared with increasing severity, but that was just the visible manifestation of deeper genetic catastrophe. Charles II couldn't chew food properly because his teeth didn't align. He couldn't speak clearly because of his jaw deformity. He didn't learn to walk until age 8. He suffered from frequent illness throughout his short life. When he died at 38, without producing an heir despite 2 marriages, his autopsy revealed the full extent of the damage. His physicians reported that he had a heart the size of a walnut, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrid, and he had only a single testicle, black as coal. The report concluded that it was a miracle his body had sustained life at all. Charles II's death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that lasted from 1701 to 1714 and killed an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 people across Europe. All because a dynasty so obsessed with genetic purity had destroyed itself from within. The irony is perfect. The system designed to concentrate power through selective breeding had created an heir so damaged that he couldn't fulfill the most basic requirement of kingship, producing the next generation. But the Habsburgs weren't unique. Royal families across Europe who practiced extensive intermarriage saw similar patterns. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt practiced sibling marriage for generations and saw increasing rates of physical deformity and stillbirths. The royal families of various German states, all interrelated through complex marriage alliances, passed genetic conditions back and forth until certain traits appeared with statistical improbability in multiple lines simultaneously. The demographic data tells a brutal story. Infant and child mortality among European royalty in the medieval and early modern periods was not significantly lower than among the general population, despite access to better nutrition and medical care. In some periods and some families, royal child mortality was actually higher than average. The combination of genetic problems from inbreeding and the sheer number of pregnancies royal women endured created a death rate that undermined the whole purpose of the system. The succession crises created by this mortality had continent-wide consequences. When royal lines died out for lack of suitable heirs, neighboring kingdoms went to war over succession claims. The 100 Years' War between England and France was partly triggered by succession disputes. The Wars of the Roses in England were fought over competing claims to a throne, left uncertain by the absence of clear heirs. The 30 Years' War devastated Central Europe, partly because of succession conflicts in the Holy Roman Empire. The obsession with producing perfect heirs had created a system that regularly failed to produce any heirs at all, and the resulting power vacuums filled with violence. The children who were rejected, institutionalized, or murdered because they didn't meet standards of perfection might have actually been healthier breeding stock than the children who were accepted. A child born with a minor physical disability but otherwise healthy genes might have produced healthier grandchildren than a child who looked perfect but carried multiple recessive genetic problems. But the system couldn't see that because it judged based on immediate appearance rather than long-term genetic health. The historical record preserves thousands of cases where royal dynasties practiced infanticide, exposure, or institutionalization to eliminate unsuitable children. But it also preserves the consequences. Dynasties that died out, kingdoms that collapsed into civil war, genetic lines that destroyed themselves through the very purity they sought to maintain. The children thrown from cliffs in Sparta, exposed on Roman roadsides, suffocated in medieval birthing rooms, locked away in monasteries, or murdered in towers were individual tragedies. But they were also symptoms of a larger systemic failure. The system assumed that royal blood was inherently superior, and that concentrating this superiority through selective breeding would create ever more perfect rulers. Instead, it created genetic bottlenecks that trapped diseases, amplified problems, and produced children whose bodies were falling apart before they were even born. The autopsy reports from late-period Habsburg royals read like horror stories. Internal organs missing, duplicated or malformed, skeletal structures twisted, immune systems so compromised that minor infections became life-threatening. These weren't natural variations. They were the predictable results of a breeding system that had been running for too many generations with too small a gene pool. The final revelation is that the cruelty was pointless. The system didn't preserve dynasties. It destroyed them. The children who were killed for being imperfect were eliminated by a system that was itself deeply imperfect, that couldn't recognize its own failure even as it produced generation after generation of increasingly damaged heirs. The Spanish Habsburgs went extinct. The French Valois died out. Multiple German royal lines vanished. The Tudors produced no third-generation heirs. Dynasty after dynasty that practiced ruthless selection of heirs found that the selection criteria they'd chosen were selecting for their own extinction. The royal children deemed unsuitable and eliminated from succession weren't the weakness in the system. They were evidence of what the system was doing to itself. Every rejected baby, every institutionalized child, every murdered heir was proof that the genetic strategy wasn't working. But the people in power couldn't see it, or refused to see it, because acknowledging the problem would have required admitting that the entire structure of royal legitimacy was built on a biological impossibility. In the end, the brutal reality of royal infanticide and the treatment of defective heirs isn't just about the cruelty of individual acts. It's about the systematic cruelty of a system that placed abstract ideas about bloodline purity above human life, that sacrificed children to preserve power, and that ultimately destroyed the very dynasties it was designed to protect. The children who died in their first hours, who vanished into monasteries, who were murdered in towers, they weren't aberrations. They were the system working exactly as designed. And the system, in the end, devoured everything it touched.